Hello my friends, I hope we are here live today. It is 12:15 a.m. on August 24th, and I want to talk to you guys about understanding specs of AV receivers and amplifiers. OBS just did an update, so I'm hoping this is working okay. Someone please verify that you can hear and see me all right. Cool, you guys could see me all right. So, guys, I've been thinking about all the different specmanships that manufacturers use in their amplifiers and receivers, and I see numerous questions on the forums about how much voltage output can a preamplifier have, and is it enough to handle for a power amplifier? And I figured, it's a good topic to discuss here, and it gets me more used to doing this live streaming thing. So why don't we go over some receivers and some power amplifiers, and we can kind of break all this stuff down. So what I'd like to do is start with a screen share, as I usually do here, and I'll stop periodically to answer some questions if I can. Let me go. Everything changed on this stupid program, so I hope this works. Okay, so I wanted to start with the preamp voltage of receivers and looking at a Denon, hoping you guys can see my specs here. And I have a bunch of stuff open, so here's kind of where I wanted to see. Let me just make sure this is working. Okay, so if you look at this Denon receiver, it's the 6400H model, I believe. It's the, 3 down from their flagship. Looking at the specs on the last page, or second to last page of the manual, it looks like the analog outputs are rated at 1.2 volts. So when people see this on the forums, they think, oh, this receiver only puts out 1.2 volts maximum. I need 2 volts to drive an amplifier that I'm attaching to in order for that amplifier to reach full power. Well, I wanted to show you that this is not actually an output maximum voltage. What this rated output is basically telling you at 1.2 volts, the signal to noise ratio is 102 dB A weighted, and this is the bandwidth. This is the input sensitivity. So they're giving you kind of the conditions of how they derive this spec. So with a 200 millivolt input at 1.2 volts out, you expect to see 102 dB signal to noise ratio, A weighted, which is a filtering scheme, in direct mode, and this is the bandwidth. This is not a maximum output voltage, and in fact most of the Denon receivers that I've measured and the Marantz receivers that I've measured, they'll put out a clean 4 volts RMS on the outputs. So you have no problem driving an amplifier to clipping. If it's a standard amplifier of 29 dB of gain, and you've got a 200 watt amplifier, you'll reach full power well below 2 volts, probably around 1.6, 1.7 volts. So that's not the problem. Now there are other issues that I've noted in other videos about how most of these receivers, even though they'll put out a clean 4 volt RMS, their power amplifiers are usually clipping at a little over a volt or so, and that could cause distortion to come back into the line through the power supply. It's not something you see as clipping, it's something you see as some nasty harmonics in an FFT display. I'm actually trying to get manufacturers to offer a preamp mode for all of their, at least their upper end receivers that have preamp outputs, so you could physically disconnect the power amp from the preamp section when you're using external amplification. So hopefully in the next couple of generations down the road, we'll see that some of the top tier models like the Denon AVRX 8500 have a preamp mode that does exactly that, and some of the older Yamaha units like an RX-Z7 had a preamp mode that physically put a series of relays between the power amps and the preamp and physically disconnected that path, so you wouldn't be clipping those amplifiers even if you're not using them. But I don't want to go too far into that because that's off spec of what we're trying to talk about here. So what I wanted to show you here again is that this is not the maximum voltage here. Just like the digital output here, they're just giving you a rating. They're saying at 2 volts at a 0 dB playback, this is the distortion, this is the signal noise ratio. Unless it says maximum, you're not really getting your maximum rating there. So I wanted to look at some other specs here. We have, let's see, I think this is a Yamaha one. No, that's for power I want to talk about. Yeah, that's good for voltage. Let's get into the power topic. There's two topics I want to talk about with power. One is power consumption, and then the other is power ratings. So people often look on the back of a receiver and they say, oh, look, this receiver only puts out 490 watts. It's rated at 150 watts times 11 or times 9. So how is it only 490 watts on the back panel? And what's this 620 VA thing? So this is basically apparent power, and then this is actual power. So because it's a reactive load, you have some losses, because your voltage and your current are not 100% in phase. So really you want to kind of look at this rating, the power rating here. But what I've come to find when I'm looking at manufacturers' power ratings on receivers, and I'm looking at how they're doing their ratings, they're not all consistent. So this is, unless this says it's a maximum rating, it's not necessarily a maximum rating. Sometimes the manufacturers will rate, 2 channels driven at full power with the other channels driven at 1/8. Or sometimes they'll just give you a 2-channel rating and then they factor in the efficiency differences and stuff like that. So don't assume that this receiver only puts out 490 watts total power. In fact, on the Denon model, I didn't measure this Yamaha, so I won't comment too much on that. But on the Denon, I think it was the, which is the one I recently reviewed. I'm sorry, on the Marantz one, the Marantz SR8012. I think the max power, or the power on the back of the Marantz one, said it was like 780 watts. And we could look at the Marantz SR8012 back panel. And let's see an image here. Hopefully we could find one that actually has a power thing on the back. I'm on Crutchfield. Give us a good picture. So yeah, if you look for the power rating on here, it says 780 watts. And that, again, is not a max power rating, because I measured the SR8012 and it put out about 90 something watts with 7 channels driven, maybe 100 watts. So 90 times 7 is 630, and then you factor in inefficiency. I was dissipating over 900 watts when I did that test. So again, this is not a max power rating. If you look at some of the older receivers, they used to give you the max power rating, like a Denon AVR 5805, and I hate to keep bringing that receiver up. I know it's kind of like such a cherished model for me, but it was really a benchmark in receivers. It's hard to see in this picture, the picture quality is not that great, but this one says power consumption 13 amps. That is most likely a max rating, because if you take 13 and times it by 120, that's 1560 watts. That's close to a 15 amp line. So a receiver like the 5805 was able to sustain and deliver near the full wall outlet from a 15 amp line, because this thing had a massive toroid and a bunch of E-core transformers. But from what I've found is these companies do not rate power, on the back panel unless it says max power. You don't really know how they're rating it. I asked Denon how they did the 3600 power numbers, and they gave me some weird formula with like 1/8 channels driven, and then they factored in all this other stuff about loading and heat dissipation. It was something so crazy that it kind of made me cross-eyed, and I was like, you know what, I give up. I thought maybe it was just a standard straightforward thing, but there's no standardization, and it really kind of sucks. I wish manufacturers would come up with a max power rating, kind of like what you did years ago when you'd build your own PC. You'd buy a certain size power supply knowing how much power you're going to use. Unfortunately, this is not the case with receivers. There's really no standardization in how they rate power, and it's kind of like that with power amplifiers too. So if you look at this Anthem, I actually like the way they did this one. This is the Anthem STR, really good amp. I'm using this as my reference amp to power my 8T RBH speakers. what they did was kind of cool because they don't really tell you max power, but they tell you typical power levels. So when the amp is idling and you're just kind of listening, they give you an idle power. So that's probably when there's nothing driving it at all. That's just a quiescent current biasing the transistors. And then typical playback levels, because most of the time your amplifier is at low levels, you're probably using a couple of watts a channel. So this is the kind of power you're dissipating between 150 and 300. And then you're usually high power level 600 to 1100. Now, of course, when I measured this amplifier, I did the rated 400 watts times 2 at 8 ohms. So 400 times 2 is 800. Again, if you assume maximum efficiency of Class AB when it's fully loaded, 70%, that's putting out about 1100 watts. That's about right. That's about what they're saying here. So that makes sense. Although it doesn't say max power, they're giving you kind of an estimate of high power usage. They're being very legit about their power consumption. If you look at Class A, which I love Class A amplifiers, these are some of the best I've ever measured. I think this is just a screw up in specmanship. I don't know where they're coming up with this 763 watts at 1/8 power into 8 ohms. That makes no sense, because if you take 300 watts and you do 1/8 of that, that's 37 or 38 watts times 2, and you factor again 0.7 efficiency. That should be dissipating, you know, like a little over 100 watts. I don't know what they're doing with this rating here, and I probably would have to send them an email to figure that out. I'm not trying to single them out. I'm just trying to show that this is just, sometimes you get weird specmanship here. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to show you before we go on to actual power. One of the companies I've always kind of found their power ratings dicey is Sunfire, and how they do their power spec. Now they're telling you here that this is 12 amps. I'm assuming that's the 15 amp fuse. Okay, so they may be telling you here that 12 amps is the maximum power consumption of this amplifier. So let's assume that's correct. 12 times 120 is 1440 watts. Okay, so let's say this thing could do 1440 watts continuously, and maybe for peaks do 15 amps before that slow blow fuse blows out. Now this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is a 7-channel amplifier. But what they're telling you is they're telling you that this amplifier is 400 watts for all the channels. And it's always been kind of a dicey thing because they don't even tell you how many channels are driven. And some people I see on the forums going, I got a Sunfire amp, it's 400 watts times 7, all channels driven. Yeah, off of one power cord with a 15 amp fuse. I don't care what kind of efficiency your amplifier has, unless it's a superconductor, you're not putting out that kind of power. Let's do a little math here. So you got 400 times 7. Without factoring in inefficiencies, that's 2,800 watts. Okay, so let's say this is still a linear AB. It's got a track down converter, but the max efficiency at full power is not going to be any different for a Class G or H as a Class AB. It's still the same thing. It's all about the efficiency of the Class G and Class H amplifiers. The benefits of that is when you're switching between low and high power, it's just more efficient at the lower power because you're on a lower rail voltage. But when you're at full power, they're both dissipating the same amount of power. So again, let's say assume 0.7 for efficiency, and I'm being generous. That's 4,000 watts. Let's divide that by 120 volts. Okay, that means you need a 33 amp line to deliver 400 times 7. Not going to happen, my friends. Not off of one power cord, not with a 15 amp fuse like this amplifier shows you right here. So this is a bogus spec. And if you look at how they're speccing this, they're being a little bit tricky about this. They're saying 8 ohms at 1 kilohertz. They're not even giving you a full bandwidth spec. They're not even giving you 2 channels driven FTC full bandwidth. We should call these guys out on this. This is BS. This is a bogus spec. They've been doing this for years. This is not something that just happened overnight. But you know, nobody questions it until we start questioning it, because we want truth and power. It's part of our truth and power movement. So this is again an example of specmanship and trying to read between the fine lines, because not everything is rated equally. As opposed to, you look at this Class A amplifier, they're actually telling you both channels driven, up to 500 kilohertz, so it's full power bandwidth, and they're going 300 watts into 8 ohms, 600 watts into 4 ohms, and they're showing you a distortion much lower than a lot of other amplifiers are telling you. 0.002%, that's on the left side of the power versus distortion curve. That's not the knee where it's going up and it's getting clipped. That's a very low distortion. That's good specmanship, and I love seeing amplifiers rated like that. And Anthem is similar. So Anthem again gives you 400 watts. Look at that distortion level, 0.0007 THD at 1 kilohertz and 0.004 at 20K. I like that they give you more than one data point. So some amplifiers at high frequencies can have higher distortion because of slew-induced distortion at high frequencies. They're showing you here that this amp is very linear at full rated power. So that's a good spec. And I wanted to see what else I wanted to show you before we move on. Now here's another thing I wanted to show you that's interesting. If you look at NAD or NAD, whatever you want to call it, I do like the fact that they give you full disclosed power with all channels driven. So they're telling you it's 110 watts at 8 ohms with 2 channels driven, full bandwidth, or 60 watts times 7 at with 7 channels driven at full bandwidth, again at a certain distortion that's below clipping. So looking at this receiver, you're like, oh, you know, this is a more powerful receiver than probably like some of the Japanese ones like Denon or Yamaha. Yeah, it is and it isn't. To be honest with you, a Denon 6500 that's rated at 110 watts a channel, even though they only tell you it's 2 channels driven in the specs. Let's go to the specs here. If we could find the specs. So when this is actually 140, I think. Okay, so this one's 140 watts, 2 channels driven, right? So the thing about the Denon and Marantz models is they guarantee 70% power rating with up to 5 channels driven. So you got 140 and you do 0.7. That means this receiver will do 98 watts with 5 channels driven. And I've measured most Denon receiver amplifiers, and they'll still drive 7 channels without going into protection. They'll be a little bit derated. So in this case, this is 98 watts with 5 channels driven. This receiver will do probably, I'm going to guess, at least 80 watts with 7 channels driven. So the NAD is not more powerful than this receiver. I mean, you're splitting hairs when you're talking about 110 watts versus 140 watts, or 80 watts versus 60 watts. It's minuscule amounts of power. So you take like 140 watts versus 110 watts, do the log of that times 10. You're talking about a dB difference in loudness. But it's not just about that we're looking at with power. We're looking at, you know, can this receiver be able to deliver sustained power with multiple channels driven? Because some receivers fall apart when you drive more than 2 channels. I've seen this. I've measured, you know, some of the lower end Yamahas, like the 860, for example. That thing couldn't drive 4 ohm loads to save its life. Neither could the Integra DRX 4.3. And then when you drove them more than a couple of channels, they would go into protection. So it's really about how much nanny control they have on these receivers, because, you know, they don't have enough heatsink area, or they don't have a big enough power supply to handle it. So, you know, you got to kind of look at how things are rated. There were a couple other points I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah, I want to talk about signal to noise ratio, and that's another thing that's often misconstrued. I see people online saying, oh, my amplifier's got 130 dB SNR, and my amplifier's got 126 dB SNR. Well, that's all relative to what the input drive signal was, how much power it was rated at, and if it was A-weighted or not. So I'm going to kind of show you guys a trick here on figuring this out. So this Class A amplifier says minus 116 dB at peak output into 8 ohms. Okay, so if we have, I'm going to use some math here, I hope you don't mind. If you have 300 watts, which is what this power amplifier is rated at, and at 8 ohms, so 300 times 8 times the square root of that is basically 49 volts RMS. So if you want to scale this down to 1 watt now, because you want to compare all your amplifiers at the equal power level, assuming they have the same input drive, because most amplifiers have a 29 dB gain, so you got to kind of look at that too. So in this case, we have 49 volts divided by 2.83, and do the anti-log of that. I'm sorry, I messed that up. 300 8 times square root 2.83 divides, or I do the log. Where's the log function? I'm not doing something right here. 300 8 times 2.83 divide. Okay, I'm hitting the wrong button here. And then 20, okay, so I got it. It's 1.23. Now you got to multiply by 20 because voltage is in 20 log of voltage. So you have to subtract now 24.76 dB from the 116 dB number. I hope this isn't too boring, but I'm just trying to show you guys how this stuff is related. So you're looking at 91 dB at 1 watt, and I'm assuming this is an A-weighted. Let's look at what it says. They don't tell you signal to noise ratio if they use a weighting filter. Oh yeah, they do. All tests are unweighted and 500 kilohertz measured bandwidth except SNR. So I'm assuming, oh here it is. They said measured bandwidth at 22K. So there's different ways of doing SNR. You either do A weighting or you do what they did where it's measurement bandwidth of 22K. I kind of prefer the 22K because it's more conservative than doing A weighted. But the industry standard when it comes to SNR dynamic range is usually A-weighted. It just makes things look better. It's a more steeper filter. So when I measured that amplifier, I measured the older version of the amplifier. I measured 94 dB A-weighted, 92 dB with a 20 kilohertz filter engaged. So again, look at that. I'm right by what Class A spec. I'm within a dB. And that's good. I love having correlation. Anytime I measure a receiver or an amplifier, I look at how the manufacturer specs it and I try to recreate it. So you can see when it was A-weighted, there was a couple of dB advantage here for the A weighting. And a lot of that depends on the amplifier topology, the power supply. And I suspect if this has a linear supply and it's a linear amp, but I suspect if you measured a Class D, or you measured an amplifier, a linear amplifier with an SNPS, like the new Emotivus, for example, the A-weighted measurement would be much higher than the 22 kilohertz bandwidth limited measurement because there's more out-of-band harmonics with this SNPS and there's more out-of-band harmonics with a Class D. That's when you're going to start seeing bigger discrepancies there in those two numbers. So again, we go look at the Anthem and how they spec'd SNR here. Theirs is at 121 dB. So whoa, it sounds like it's a better, quieter amp than the Class A. But 121 dB is referenced to 400 watts. So again, we go 400, 8 times that, find the voltage, square root of that is 56.6 volts, divide by 2.83, times the log, times 20, 26 dB minus 121. That's 95 dB. Now that's A-weighted. So you remember when I said the A-weighting gives you a little bit of a better number? So that can explain why this number looks a little bit better at 1 watt. It's IEC A-weighted, whereas the Class A amplifier is rated at 22 kilohertz bandwidth filter. So I think I have the Anthem measurements here. I wanted to go over. Oh, one thing Anthem did with the STR that I kind of call them out on, and this stuff measured awesome. The Anthem STR preamp and power amp were really state of the art, especially the analog to digital converter in the STR. A lot of companies today with their pre-pros, they forget about good performance with the ADC. Like the Yamaha CXA 5200, for example, the ADC on that is average. It adds like 10 dB of noise to the signal. The Anthem analog to digital converters were freaking state of the art, man. I could barely measure a difference. And I think the reason why they did that is they wanted their phono preamp stage to be taken seriously because they had different curves. You could tailor the sound of the phono preamp stage. And also they wanted you to apply the Arc Genesis room correction without causing any deleterious effects. So kudos to Anthems for giving us good analog to digital converters because that's often forgotten in home theater and hi-fi today. But one thing that Anthem did that kind of irked me a bit is they when they measured SNR and they spec'd SNR of their preamp, they actually had a stronger or a more powerful input voltage versus the output voltage. So it was like a reverse amplifier. I was like, how the hell are you getting these 123 dB numbers And then that's when they told me, you know, I have the paragraph here, that they were driving the inputs with 2 volts RMS while they were measuring 1 volt out, that kind of stuff. So there's a 6 dB advantage when you do that in SNR. I don't agree with that kind of specmanship. It's not an industry standard. However, I did measure it like they did to confirm it, and then I scaled it back to how I normally measure SNR to show you what the real numbers are. And this thing was state of the art in every aspect. I had no complaints. I just didn't like how they did their specmanship. So that's about what I wanted to talk about that. Oh, and then gain on amplifiers. If you want to figure some stuff out, here's something interesting to note. So if you've got an amplifier that has, I'm trying to see which one I wanted to show you. Give me a second here. This one's 29 dB, input sensitivity 2.1 volts. So this is the Anthem. Okay, so if you want to kind of figure out how much power you need to hit full power, and you can kind of backtrack this here. So you got 29 dB is your voltage gain. Divide by 20, do the anti-log of that. The gain of this amplifier is 28.18. So if you take 28.18 and multiply that by their input sensitivity, which is 2.1 volts, that's 59 volts RMS. Square that, divide by 8. That means that this amplifier will give you 437 watts before it clips. Now it's rated at 400 watts, and I'm sure when I measured it, it delivered at least 400 watts. And we'll go back to my measurements. I don't remember because I measure so many things. So we got actually 450 watts at 1%. So this thing was really conservative. These are really conservative specs, and you'll notice that when you're dealing with high-end stuff like the Anthems and the Class A's, their stuff is very conservatively rated. It's not like the AV receivers where they're kind of giving you the power ratings on the distortion side of the power versus distortion curve, whereas these guys are giving it to you to the left side of the curve before the knee. They're giving it to you on the clean side. They're being very conservative about that. So I just thought it'd be interesting to show you guys how you calculate your sensitivity and kind of swag at how much power you get on these amplifiers. We can do that again for the Class A one. If they give me the voltage gain, yes they did. Okay, so let's do it one more time, just just for shits and giggles. Again, a standard gain of 29 dB, divide by 20. You have to have a scientific calculator to do this, by the way. I don't remember logs in my head. Do the A log of it. That's a 28.18. Now they're saying at, where's that voltage? 1.88 volts RMS. That's 53 volts. Square that, divide by 8. That's 350 watts. So even though this thing is rated at 300 watts, it produces 350 watts power. And I believe that's what I measured. I think this amplifier was also conservatively weighted. See, I got 360 watts. 340 if you're talking about 2 channels driven, 360 with 1 channel driven. So that kind of gives you some idea on specmanship. Just to give you kind of a recap, nobody's really given you, there's no standard way of measuring max power consumption on these products. Don't assume the power on the back of the receiver or the back of the amplifier is max unless it says max. It has to usually say max power on the back, or it has to tell you how much current consumption. Like the old Denons would say 13 amps. That's a safe bet to assume that that product will put out a maximum of 13 amps. And then you could do your current times your voltage, 13 times 120, that's your power. And then you could kind of figure out how much power you have available for all your channels. Divided up by the number of channels, it gives you kind of a swag. Assuming that the nannies don't trip on the receiver, they usually will trip when you drive more than 5 or 7 channels. But the higher end ones tend to have less nannies because they have more heatsink area. They could dissipate more power. They could continue to deliver that power for longer periods of time. That's another thing I wanted to say before we move on is some people say, oh, you know, an 80 watt per channel receiver, 100 watt per channel receiver is all you need. Why would you want to have a separate amplifier? Well, they're not thinking steady state. They're thinking like, you know, instantaneous power. The lower end models just can't sustain this kind of power for more than, you know, a couple of seconds. without it going into protection or turning on fans or just getting really nasty and distorted, saturating the transformer. See, a transformer can deliver more power than its rating for short periods of time, but it goes into saturation, and that's when things start getting nasty. So when you get a better product, you get a more powerful or more high-end amplifier, it has more heatsink area, it's got a bigger power supply, it could sustain these power levels longer. And again, there's really no standard in how long you're supposed to test power. When it says continuous, they don't tell you, was it continuous for 5 minutes? Is it continuous for 30 seconds? I know the FTC has preconditioning on amplifiers when they test them. I don't remember all the specs off the top of my head, but these guys are not rating it like that. Most of the people are not even following FTC anymore. So don't just assume if a receiver is 100 watts, 100 watts a channel times 11 channels, that you're actually getting, that sustained kind of power all the time. Maybe at best you're getting that with 2 channels driven, and then it gets derated from there. That's why sometimes separate power amplifiers make sense depending on your power needs. So that's that on power consumption and power ratings. As I said before, signal to noise ratio, you have to look at, how is it rated? What's the input signal? What's the output that it's rated at? Is it A-weighted? Is it unweighted? Or is it, 22 kilohertz or 20 kilohertz bandwidth limited? It really makes a difference when you're looking at how things are spec'd. You can't just compare amplifier A to amplifier B without the same test conditions. It's really important that you kind of look at that. And I think that kind of sums up everything I wanted to talk about here. I thought I had a couple more PDFs open. I just can't find them now. I got too much stuff open on my computer. This is for, what did I want to show you here? I don't even remember what product this is. Oh, Pioneer. Yeah, Pioneer is another one that I thought they were going to start getting more honest in their power specs, but they're doing it in their owner's manual. They're showing you the FTC rated power, but when you go on their website, they tend to show you the that 1 channel driven nonsense first. And then Yamaha, I wanted to show you, I thought I had a Yamaha page open. I think there was one more thing I wanted to recap. Oh, yeah, here it is. See, I hate this. I don't know why Yamaha's doing this lately. They look like they're giving you so much detail in their power specs with all of this crap, right? But what they're really doing is they're telling you rated power at 2 channels driven. I don't know why they have to go and they give you the 6 ohm rating, then they give you the 8 ohm rating. It's like, come on. And it's only 2 channels driven. It just seems like, look at this, it just never ends. This is for the 3080, that's for the 2080. I wish they would drop this 1 kilohertz 10% crap. I don't want to see that. That's me, to me that's more of a dynamic power test at this point. Why don't they just call it dynamic power rather than doing this nonsense? It's just taking up paper. It's, let's be environmentally friendly and get rid of this. And give us 2 channels driven, give us 5 or 7 channels driven, derated if you have to, and give us max power consumption, because again, we never know what the max power consumption is on these products, and it's a bit unsettling. I'm trying to see where Yamaha talks about this here. There's a lot of stuff here. I know Yamaha's another one when they give you power on the back. It's definitely not max power. See, this says power consumption, but it doesn't mean max power. To me, if it's a 150 watt receiver and it's putting out 490 watt, that looks like they're driving 2 channels driven, and then maybe the other channel's at 1/8. So here's what's interesting though. If you look at in every model except for America, USA, they're actually saying max power consumption, 1210 watts. That's a useful piece of information. I didn't even notice that till now. So that's very interesting. I don't know why they don't do that in the USA. That's something I guess I gotta kind of look into. So that's that. I'm gonna unshare my screen and kind of look and see if you guys have any comments. If I can find you. Where's my window? Okay. So I hope that kind of clears things up for you guys. I'm going to kind of look through some of the comments here for a few minutes. Well, there's a lot of them here. From a person who builds the MCA Anthem 525 each week in Paradigm. Oh, that's cool. Anybody have, it's a lot of comments, but I don't see any real questions. I'm not capable of super chat, only moderately impactful chat. Yeah, super chat's just I don't even care about the money, to be honest with you. It's like a couple of dollars, whatever, but it just gets noticed, and I could see, you know, the comment more. I have the MCA 525, that's Anthem. Just not sure what it really capable of because I don't utilize it fully. I'd probably knock my ears off if I tried. Yeah, well, those are good amplifiers. Thanks a lot. I'm sure YouTube commenters will enjoy criticizing an audiophile channel for having bad audio. Well, I hope the audio is better now. I mean, I'm using OBS. I don't like OBS. I really don't. It's cumbersome. I don't even know how to add other people to the stream without having to manage too much stuff. But it doesn't compress the hell out of the stream like all the other ones do. I'm probably going to use StreamYard again when I have some guests on because it's so easy. So the quality is not going to be as good as it is now. MRX needs an update. Okay. Let me scroll down more. Preamp voltage, what's the typical range? Usually, if you buy a preamp, a dedicated preamp, you're not going to have a problem. I haven't seen any preamps that can't put out 2 volts unbalanced, 4 volts balanced. 2 volts is usually the voltage you need to drive most amplifiers into full power if they have a gain of 29 dB. And that's why it's important to look at the gain of the amplifier and then the input sensitivity so you kind of can figure that out. I got 2200 to buy an AVR. Do I buy a Denon 6500 or 3600 along with a monolith 3 times 200 amp? All my mids are at least 6.5 inch. If you don't need the external amplifier, if you're using all small speakers all around, I'd probably go with the better receiver since you don't really need that amp. But if you're powering some towers up front, or if you're just doing some serious partying with some big speakers, I would probably go with the 3600 and then add the monolith amp up front. That's a really good deal right now. Can you talk more about the output sensitivity rating not being the max? Can I test it with a multimeter? And I'm very curious of the AVR power of an external amp. I own a Pioneer SC85. You can't test clipping with a multimeter, unfortunately. I mean, what you could do is you could keep turning the volume up and looking at the voltage on the multimeter, and then when it stops going up, you know you're definitely clipping, but you don't know when you're clipping without seeing it on at least an O-scope. An O-scope gives you like 40 dB of resolution, so you know if it's clipping, you're at 1% distortion at that point. But yeah, you need better equipment than just using a multimeter. Let's see. I wouldn't trust 15 amp breaker on such a massive receiver. I'd want 20 amp breaker. Yep, I agree. If you're getting a big honking amplifier like that Denon 5805, I used a 20 amp line on it. I do everything over design. That's my engineering nature. In my home theater room, I have 2 dedicated 20 amp lines powering, you know, all my power equipment. I would even do a 20 amp line for your subs if you can. It's always better to have more power than less. Don't use shared lines. Don't plug your subwoofers into shared outlets if you can avoid it. I had a case where I had subwoofers plugged into the same outlet that happened to be used in a bathroom or something, and anytime the hairdryer would turn on, you'd hear static coming out of the sub, and it would limit power significantly. So it's always good to have dedicated lines when you can, especially when I'm doing amplifier tests. I have to use dedicated lines. I didn't do that I did it by accident on the Marantz 8012. I used a shared line and I lost about 10% of the power, and I noted that in the review. What are some weird power ratings for amplifiers? A good example, old Pioneer MA, which is 300 watt monoblock Class A amplifier that claimed 250 watts of power consumption. Yeah, you're not, Class A power amplifiers are like 25%, maybe up to 50% efficient. If your power output is exceeding your power input, that's bogus. That's Star Trek physics there. Most houses don't even have over 30 amp fuse. I don't even think you can install past 30 amp fuses. Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. So the only time you're going to get this kind of power with amplifiers with 7 channels or more is if they have 2 independent outlets to plug into and 2 power cords. I know some of the outlaw amplifiers actually have 2 outlets or 2 cords on the back, and they've got at least 2 giant Tauruds in them. Those amplifiers can deliver that kind of power, but it's kind of crazy. I mean, you're not going to use all of those channels at full power all the time. You'll blow your eardrums out. It's just weird that $2,400 they don't provide specs for all channels driven. Yeah, I don't know. I think you're talking about one of the amplifiers, right? Yeah, I think anytime you buy a multi-channel amplifier like that Sun, I'm sure the Sunfire is a good amp. I'm not trying to beat them to it like a horse. I should get one in to bench test it because the fact that they're not giving you full power bandwidth with two channels driven, that's just nonsense to me. And those amplifiers are not very heavy. They're like maybe 30 or 40 pounds and they're still a linear amp. I find that suspect, and I would like to get one of those on the bench because I don't think they're giving you the 400 times 7 all channels driven. I think that's bogus. Let's see. How are Class D amps rated in comparison to AB types? I mean, the same rules apply, just Class D are more efficient. I've seen poor specmanship on Class D amplifiers as well. Some Class Ds are not good at driving lower impedance speakers. You got to look and make sure that they're rated to deliver their power into 4 ohms as well. Audio and physics is air or electrical science. Math is needed for facts. Gene, do you have a Denon 8500 in the mix? No, we had one of our reviewers, Teo, did the review on that. I didn't get one in to measure. I'm too backlogged. But when Marantz comes out with the next flagship, I'll probably trade mine up and I'll measure that one. Or maybe trade it to a Denon, I don't know, we'll see. Any relationship between power consumption and power output? Is the Class A, Class D, or AB? The Class A amplifier in that case that I measured was AB, wasn't Class D. Power consumption and power output. Yeah, I mean, if you have max power consumption, you can kind of swag how much power you're going to get in your outputs. You put it this way, your power output is going to always be at least, it's going to be similar to the power consumption. So it's good to know that. That's why I really want to have max power consumption. Sometimes I feel like I need an electrical engineer degree to follow Gene's videos. I'm sorry. I mean, I know people kind of wonder about this stuff, and you know, math at 1 o'clock in the morning, that's when I kind of wake up with my math mind. That's when I did all my homework when I was in college. I just love that. 400 watts is so much power. Yeah, that is. I'm 4 glasses of Maker's Mark in. I don't know what that means. I wish we had the other streaming software right now because I could share these comments. It's so much easier. Make sure the amplifier is at least 30% more powerful than the speaker's max power at the speaker's nominal impedance. I mean, that's a rule of thumb, I guess, but you know, the way power is rated in speaker power handling, that's another topic that we've discussed in the past. There's usually not a very good standard on how manufacturers are rating speaker power, max power capability. I just say get as much power as you could afford. Power is cheap. It's never a bad thing to have a lot of power. Good night all. Okay. I mean, if you have some insane speaker like the SDA STR 1.2, then you can handle 800 watts of power. Maybe you need to hold back trying to max that out. Yeah, those super speakers do need a lot of power. I have a 7012 and I want to add a 9-channel amp. What do you think about the Marantz 7013? I mean, the Marantz receivers are good receivers. I talk about them a lot. I know they have a stable platform with their HDMI, and like I said, the Marantz and the Denon receivers will give you that. They have that 70% rule guarantee. So whatever their 2-channel rating is, take 70% of that. It'll at least drive 5 channels at that power. That's good that they at least give you that reference because most of the receivers don't. Do you have to know the Marantz 12? Do you know if the new Marantz NR 1200 pre-out will have 2 volts? I'm sure it does. I've never measured a Marantz receiver that didn't have a strong preamp output voltage on them. What are the pros and cons using 2 AVR? I use a 4500 pre-out to an Accio 606 multi-channel inputs, try to save up for dedicated amps. I mean, I don't know why you would do that, to be honest with you. The 4500 probably have comparable amps to the Accio, unless you just need more amplification for more channels. Just use the Denon 4500. So, let's see, separates. What should I look for in a good speaker? We have videos on that. Just don't buy little cubes. Get real speakers. Questions about them. Gene, what does slew and damping do that is audible? Damping factor is kind of like an overblown thing. That was a problem back in the day of tube amplifiers that had a very high output impedance. And when you have an amplifier with a high output impedance, the frequency response of it changes depending on the load you're driving. It's kind of like some Class Ds. Some of the Class Ds, the earlier Class Ds, their frequency response radically changed for 8 ohms or 4 ohms, especially, you know, at like 20 kilohertz, right where the brick wall filter would be placed. So damping factors, it's related to output impedance. You don't need to have a giant number for damping factor, and especially because once you stick a speaker cable on it or the voice coil in the driver itself, that throws your high number right out the window. So I wouldn't worry too much about damping factor. And then the slew distortion, again, older receivers or older amplifiers had problems delivering power at full bandwidth. They would just, you would do a sweep at 1 watt and you'd say it would be flat from 20 hertz to 100 kilohertz. And then you do it at full rated power, it would only be flat from 20 hertz to maybe 15 kilohertz. I mean, the bandwidth would just go haywire. It would just start really rolling off or get really distorted at high frequencies. You don't see it as much these days because amplifier design has gotten really good. It's kind of like engine design. You know, the internal combustion engine has gone, you know, to its max. We're at the max capability of how good you can make these engines these days because they've been perfected over the years. Same thing with AV amplifiers. And to some extent, Class D, they've come a long way. You could get some really good performing Class D amplifiers now. In fact, there are some Class D amps that measure so well that I don't have to do any preconditioning on my audio precision. The older ones, they would, you know, the switchers would not be fast enough, and they would put noise into the line, and they would kind of screw up the test gear and give you bad results. But now they're so out of band, they're so fast that you almost don't even need to precondition some of these amplifiers to get good measurements on them. JVC released a 1-channel integrated amp back in 2000. Seriously, it was a stupid idea and it didn't sell well. They never tried again. I never heard of that. I know JVC used to do some good receivers back in the day, but I never seen them do an integrated amplifier. What do you think about Moran? Oh, okay, I already read that. If power is what you want, are PA amplifiers like Crown instead of audiophile? It said audiophile. You know, that's another topic I like to talk about, but I want to get some measurements behind me. But looking at some of these PA amplifiers, at the specs of them, no, the cheap ones I would never use as an audiophile amplifier. You got to realize something. When it's a PA amplifier, it's designed for that kind of application. They usually have switching power supplies, big fans in them. They're very lightweight, so they're made as cheaply as possible and to deliver, you know, bursts of power. They're not designed to be very low noise. That's not always the case. Some of the really high-end Crown units, like the ones that JBL uses with their Master 2 speakers, which are some of the most accurate horn-loaded speakers in the world, those amps are designed really well, I'm sure. Otherwise, JBL wouldn't be pairing them together. But I can't stand sometimes when I see like you go in the forums and you see people buying these $300 Behringer or Crown amplifiers and saying these are as good as an Anthem or a Class A amplifier. No, they're not. And if you look at the specs and you can see the signal noise ratio is not as good. They don't always give you full bandwidth power tests. I mean, there's no way. There's no such thing as free lunches for this stuff. There's always trade-offs. Otherwise, everybody would just take a $300 Crown amp, put it in a nice metal chassis and charge $3 grand for it. So yeah, I think there's some legitimacy to the better designed PA amplifiers to use in home audio, but definitely not those $200 or $300 ones that you find on eBay or Sam Ash and stuff like that. Not if you're really interested in good accurate reproduction with good SNR ratio. Please test it, Crown Drive Core XLS2. Our old B&K amps used worth considering. Yeah, the old B&K amplifiers were really good. The only problem you could have is if you buy an older amplifier that's 20 years old and it hasn't been recapped, you know, it's a possibility you might have to get them recapped, and that could be expensive. So kind of look at the condition of the amp before you buy it. Is Macintosh worth the money? Well, that depends on how much money you're willing to spend and, you know, how prestigious you want to be. Macintosh does make some nice amplifiers. I'm not a huge fan of the auto transformer on the outputs. Some people like that. I've measured a couple of Macintosh amplifiers when I was in college, and they always hit power spec or more, and they sounded good. And I love those big VU meters and the blue faceplate. So, you know, it depends on what you're after, I guess. The Marantz in a 1200 says 75 watts and 8 ohms. How much will it have in 4 ohms? Ugh, I mean, you shouldn't be using a little receiver like that with 4 ohm speakers, unless you're if you're driving it at modest levels, it's probably going to be okay. But isn't that one of the slimline receivers? Don't use a 4 ohm load on that. Either get a separate amp or just get a different receiver. How are power sound amps? Power sound amps are awesome. It's been years since I've measured them, but they've always been awesome. Well-designed amplifiers, you know, delivered. They hit their power spec easily. They measure well. So yeah, it's a legitimate company. So I think I'm going to wrap this up. I can answer some more questions in the comments down below. Hope you guys like this. Please hit the thumb up on it, subscribe to our channel, hit the bell notification. That way you get notices when we go live or when the next video drops. And don't forget our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. It gives you access to some of our content before it goes public, and it gives you the ability to ask us specific questions one-on-one or suggest video topics in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, keep listening.